Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I speak to a behavioural science practitioner who has recently published a book that is designed to highlight how behavioural science can help solve business problems. Richard Chataway began his career in advertising, but has since moved to work on the deployment of behavioural science across a number of fields, including working for governments and major corporates. He's recently written a book called The Behaviour Business and also has a podcast where he interviews people he spoke with whilst researching the book. Links to both are in the show notes. In our discussion, we explore how Richard came to be interested in behavioural science and then look at some of the themes he covers in his book. Many are based on his personal experiences, and he's got some fascinating stories to tell. People often ask me for the link between behavioural science and human risk. My answer is that anyone who is in the business of managing human risk, like compliance, risk, HR or audit for example, needs to understand behavioural science to be able to mitigate it. Equally, anyone who is deploying behavioural science is helping to manage human risk. After all, we use it when we want to influence behaviour, which is a form of risk mitigation. So whether you're listening as a human risk practitioner or a behavioural science fan, you're in the right place. I should add that we recorded this episode prior to the coronavirus lockdown, so we don't really talk about it in the way that we might if we were to record this now. I'm also delighted to report that Richard is true to his surname, Chataway, and we end up having a fascinating conversation that covers a broad range of issues. So please enjoy my conversation with the Behaviour Business author, Richard Chataway. So Richard Chataway, author of The Behavioural Business and host of the Behavioural Business podcast, and therefore qualifying on 2 counts to be here. Welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Look, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And there's so many things that I want to explore, your book, your podcast. But maybe to start us off, can you talk a little bit about your background and your experience in behavioural science and sort of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I started my career in working in the media and advertising world, particularly within media agencies as a planner initially, and then kind of moving more into strategy. And what actually happened was the kind of, if you like, the gateway drug or light bulb moment for behavioural science for me was about 15 years ago when I started working, actually switched into public sector and started working at the Department for Health or Department of Health, I should say. And at that point, I was working on campaigns on anti-smoking. Then, as now, smoking was the single biggest preventable cause of death in the UK. Our objective was around behaviour change for that, in terms of getting people to stop smoking and persuading people to stop smoking. And what happened was we sort of took a little bit of a left turn, if you like, in terms of the campaign strategy around how to persuade people to quit smoking. And that was driven by a couple of things. One was that the efficacy of the work we were doing was to be honest, it was getting to reaching the end of the road. There'd been 40 years of the kind of traditional shock tactic type campaigns of showing people diseased lungs and so on. And what we were starting to see from our research with smokers was that there was a bit of reactance, to use the psychological term, to that. So it was actually hardening some views and attitudes towards smoking amongst smokers. And the other thing was that, more importantly, was we started working with an external strategist called Kate Waters, who had a background in psychology, and she brought in a whole load of insights from psychology, particularly social psychology, to inform what we were doing with the campaign. And firstly, for me, that was really interesting, and the fact that kind of that sort of changed the way I thought about communications, advertising, marketing, and behaviour change in general. And the second thing was that it completely reshaped the kind of work that we were doing to be less about telling people why they should quit smoking and more about providing them with the how of quitting smoking and the tools to do that. And obviously the NHS has a number of different services available to help people with quitting smoking, and our objectives around the campaigns became as much about directing people through to those services, basically helping them quit more successfully, as it did about telling them why it was a good idea to quit smoking. And that proved to be hugely effective. And in terms of the impact it had on the campaign, we delivered our public service agreement targets a year early. We, had thousands more people engaging with NHS services as a result of that work. And for me, it was a light bulb moment, because I kind of went, oh, okay, firstly, this behavioural science stuff is really interesting. I'd like to learn more about it. And secondly, it's actually proving to be much more effective than the kind of traditional viewpoint and way of looking at human behaviour and addressing a kind of an irrational behaviour like smoking. And when you think about it, smoking is kind of the quintessential irrational behaviour, because everyone knows it's bad for them and then knows about the health consequences. That battle's been won, but people still persist in doing it. So that was the kind of... Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, were you a smoker yourself?
No. I mean, I think I dabbled maybe at university, but it was never something that really appealed to me. But I think what's very interesting about that was a lot of people must think that I'm very kind of anti-smoking, and that I for years I've had friends, knowing that this is the kind of work I've been doing for a number of years or used to do. Whenever they light up around me, they go, "Oh, sorry," and kind of be really apologetic about it. I think what's interesting about it was I spent so much time in research groups with smokers and understanding the motivations and drivers of smoking as a behaviour, that you can't help but be quite empathetic. And I think in particular about smoking, and realise that there are some aspects of it that are motivating to people. There is still an aspect around smoking looking quite cool, to be honest. But then there is also the whole thing of quitting is incredibly hard. I mean, there was a fairly recent study done in Canada, I think, amongst a large number of smokers. I think it's about 30,000 smokers. And they found that the average number of times people have to quit or attempt to quit before they quit successfully is 30. And bear in mind, that's the average number of times. So, there are some people who may quit, 50, 100, or try to quit 50, 100 times and don't succeed. So, so you can't help but being, sympathetic and empathetic towards smokers, I think, once you understand the issue a bit more.
So I had this vision of you as the Greta Thunberg of anti-smoking, if you like.
Well, I wouldn't. I think that analogy probably doesn't work on a number of different levels, but it's. But the yeah, I mean, for me, it was really, as I say, it was really eye-opening in terms of thinking about the irrationality of human behaviour. And I think one of the things that I talk about in my book as well was it was really informative for me when thinking about how we actually gather insights and research into behaviour, because I sat in God knows how many focus groups with smokers where they would be asked about their reasons for smoking and the reasons why they haven't quit. And they would come up with all kinds of counterfactuals or confabulations about why they persisted in smoking, why they hadn't quit or tried to quit, such as, I'm only losing a few bad years at the end of my life anyway. I'm only harming myself. I'm not harming any of my family because I smoke outside, etc. And what was really interesting about that was that it kind of, and it's an example I use in my book, was really interesting for me was that, it was clear that these people actually truly believed these reasons. They weren't just, saying something for the sake of the research, but also that they were post-rationalizing it, and that these were post-rationalizations. And that, if you want to get to actually what are the true drivers of behavior, if you want to get an understanding of what actually is influencing people's behavior and how to leverage that or how to combat that, then there are other ways that you need to conduct research to get to those reasons. Actually asking what people say is frequently not the same as what they do or what they intend to do. And so simply just asking people to account for their behavior or predict their behavior is always going to be a little bit limited in terms of the insights it gives you.
Yeah, for me, the comparator is always when people are standing in court. And if you think about if you're standing there in front of a judge, particularly if you're on trial yourself, the narrative that you will give around why you did things is clearly an impression of the situation that's designed to put you in the best possible light. And I think that's a really good example of how we're all perfectly prepared to kind of put a story in a particular light to make us look better than possibly we actually are. And you can see the motivation when people are in court for doing that. But I think we do that all of the time. And, it's one of the illustrations where if you ask people why they've done something, then it's not a good idea to get really good insight as to why we do things. There are lots of underlying processes going on there that we don't necessarily even understand ourselves.
Yeah. There's a quote I use in my book from Dr. Julia Ward. I think I might have the name wrong there, actually. Dr. Julia Shaw, sorry, who's a UCL, and she says memories are stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of our lives, and I think that's a really nice way of putting it. In that, like you say, if we're in court having to justify our previous behaviour, then we will construct a narrative around that. It's not that we're deliberately lying or deceiving people; it's just the way that our brains work. We will construct narratives around that in order to kind of to post-rationalise that behaviour and to make more sense of it for ourselves, to avoid the cognitive dissonance of our thoughts and our actions being different. And I think that's a really helpful way of looking at things. And again, it's very easy for us to be judgmental about that, but it's just the nature of being human. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that people do.
And one of the things you highlight in the book is the fact that you spent some time living in Australia, and that's clearly influenced you in many different ways, as living overseas clearly does. And one of the insights I thought was really interesting was when you were talking about what it was like to go shopping when you first moved there, and the idea that you walked into the supermarket and the brands that you could see weren't the ones you recognised. And so a relatively simple exercise of going and doing some shopping became more complicated because some of the signposts and the shortcuts, if you like, that you would ordinarily have used no longer applied in that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a really it's a helpful way of thinking about the role that brands play in our lives and how they influence our decision and our decision making. So our decisions and our decision making. And so the way I describe it in the book is to think of brands as basically being heuristics, being mental shortcuts that we use to help us make decisions. And if you think about when you go to your local supermarket, your Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Asda, whatever, when you go into the supermarket, aside from knowing where to go in the supermarket to find the relevant items, although as we know, supermarkets tend to try and mix things up a little bit to keep us on our toes. But when you go into the supermarket, there is a whole load of signals, signs, branding, which are at a non-conscious level helping guide your decision making, and you become really aware of that if you do move to another country and you go to a supermarket there, or even if you're just on holiday and you go into a supermarket, because suddenly all of those signs, signals, semiotics are basically non-existent, or they're different, And when I moved to Australia, that was one thing that really shocked me, because you don't anticipate the language barrier being a big issue, because Australians mostly, I should say, speak the same language as we do in the UK. But actually, what really surprised me is obviously all the brands are different. Some of the colours and so on that are used, and the products are different. There are obviously some cultural differences as well. And so when you go into the supermarket, it suddenly becomes an impossibly hard problem for you to actually do your weekly shop, and it takes some time to get used to that. And for me, that was a really eye-opening moment in terms of thinking about thinking about brands and thinking about, there's all these things going on that are beyond our conscious awareness of how we use brands to help guide our decision making and how we use them to make purchases. And I think what's really interesting for me is that I now work for a company, BVA, whose heritage and has been around shopper insights to some degree, and they've been using this kind of knowledge for a long time, and to the extent where we have these shopper labs. Or Pearson Vivo, our sister agency, have these shopper labs which are basically fake supermarkets. The only way you can get a good gauge on how people are making decisions in the supermarket environment is you recreate a supermarket and you get people to go around as if they were doing their weekly shop, and see how changing some signs and packaging and branding and so on impacts on that behaviour. Because again, simply going out and asking people about that is only going to give you a limited amount of useful information, because so much of that decision-making process is happening at a non-rational level.
And as you were talking, I thought actually perfect excuse moving to a new country to spend the day watching sporting or other events, because clearly there's a load of ads being pumped at you. So perfect excuse for anybody who wishes to justify having moved to a new country, spending an afternoon watching sports, is that you can say you're acclimatizing to the advertising environment so that you know what to do when you're sent to go shopping.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that because, I use the supermarketing example, but I must admit I'm naturally averse to supermarkets as an environment anyway. I find them fascinating from a human perspective, but I hate shopping as an activity anyway. I'm all about choice satisficing when it comes to buying products. So the invention of online supermarket shopping was a real godsend for me. And when we were in Australia, my wife, it has to be said, she does most of the shopping, if not all the food shopping for us. But she said to me, that she had exactly the same problem, but also that, the best way she got to acclimatize was actually exactly as you say, watching TV, seeing ads. Ads were actually, performed a function whereby for her, they kind of told her what these various brands and products were, what they actually did and what they sold and which ones to look out for. So yeah, and there's a story in my book from a friend of mine, Ian Pritchard, who lives in Melbourne, but he's actually from Aberdeen originally, and he tells the same story or has the same experience of going to the supermarket. And he said the only way he could do his first shop when he got to Australia was he had to basically stalk someone in the store to see what they were buying, and then follow that just to make sure that he didn't buy salt when he wanted sugar and vice versa. So yeah, and I think, as I say, it tells us a lot about how brands operate, and particularly how much of our associations that we have with brands and how they guide our decision making is actually happening at a non-conscious level.
So Richard, you, like many people, have trodden that path of starting out in advertising and then moving into a sort of broader business topics, and comes across in the book because it's not a book that's written for advertisers, although clearly if you do work in that industry it is still relevant to you. It's written for people in business in general, and you make the point that if you're in business, you're in the business of influencing human decision making. How did you make that transition from the kind of world of advertising into that broader business context for deploying behavioural science? Yeah,
so I guess the way, I mentioned obviously when I started working in the Department of Health and that, kind of broadened the scope of what I was doing in terms of, it was all campaigns related, but a lot of the work we were doing was marketing in its very broadest sense, in terms of, we were, working with some of the NHS services and producing, leaflets and things that were going to GP surgeries and using, every available channel, if you like, to influence people. Then when I went to Australia, I was working for a media agency, but the role I had was I was heading up strategy for federal government in Australia. So I wasn't just working on smoking or even public health, but actually all of the things that government does to try and in terms of changing behaviour. And whenever there was any kind of communications or media needed for that, my role was to lead the strategy for that. So we were working on everything from public health issues like smoking, obesity, so on. We did some work on road safety. We were working on getting people to return their tax returns on time, addressing issues like climate change, everything that government is trying to address, which basically covers pretty much every field of human behaviour, if you like. We were developing strategies around that, and so for me, that firstly, I found that the knowledge that I had again from sort of being fortunate enough to kind of be at the kind of ground level when behavioural insights were being applied within UK government. From my work here, I was able to bring that knowledge to what I was doing to Australia. But also the second aspect of it was because it was so varied, the work we were doing. I mean, one of the things I loved about that particular job was that genuinely, I come in on a Monday morning and I would have no idea what aspects of human behaviour I'd have to deal with that week. Some weeks, I remember there was one week where I think I had a brief which was about climate change, another one which was about dangerous animals, another one which was about taxation, and a final one which was about recruitment for the armed forces. So, if you think about the variety of those the sheer variety of those challenges and the sheer variety of the people and the behaviours involved with all of those things, that's, if you're interested and curious about human behaviour, that's really fascinating to be able to do. It wasn't, I was lucky in that it wasn't simply, we've got to sell more of product X that particular week. And that kind of gave me a great grounding and knowledge, and then around how behavioural insights, behavioural science can be applied to a variety of different fields. But also, what it meant when I came back from Australia in 2015. I had that experience and that knowledge, but also I was really, my determination and ambition was to specifically focus on the behavioural aspects of it and how it can be applied in a variety of different fields. And that's what drove me really in terms of writing the book, was this understanding that actually, having that understanding of those drivers of human behaviour can be applied to any field of life in general, but particularly within businesses. All of the key challenges that businesses are facing now, behavioural science can provide frameworks and tools to help you with addressing those. Because, as you know well, and I know from listening to previous podcast episodes, business problems are human problems. Because ultimately, for the time being at least, businesses are still producing products and services for humans, for use by humans. And, even if you are using machines to produce those products and services, there are still humans that are programming those machines and sit behind it. And an awful lot of products and services, as we know, are still being delivered by humans as well. So unless you have an understanding of how to drive those behaviours amongst humans, then you're limiting your effectiveness as a business. So for me, that was the kind of, the insight behind my own work, but also in particular, in writing this book.
And there's a lovely anecdote in the book, and I just wanted to quote from it. And you put, "I vividly remember once encountering this when I worked at the Department of Health. In a 2007 meeting, I suggested testing a new course of action to one of the other campaign team. A colleague who had been working in the same role for 30 years gave the somewhat testy reply, 'We tried that in 1982. It didn't work.' And I love that, because I think that's a very, very prevalent attitude, where you have people referencing things that they may or may not have tried ages ago as a reason for not trying new things now. And I thought it was a really interesting insight into the human psyche.
Yeah. And I guess, that for me, that was something that's always stuck with me, both in terms of, the demonstration of that kind of fixed mindset of not wanting to, not wanting to challenge the conventional wisdom. But also the aspect of not recognizing that the world changes and people change to a certain extent, and so the two key takeouts, I guess, from the book for me, and I hope that this is clear from it, is firstly around that behavioural science is underutilized in business, and that it has an awful lot of value and can be applied in a whole range of contexts by businesses to help them solve their problems. But the second is that it is a science, and in order to apply it effectively, you need to be adopting the scientific method in terms of testing and learning. Now, I don't want to, overemphasize that too much, in the sense of saying that, unless you are conducting, incredibly complex randomized control trials, to a standard that could be published in an academic journal, you're not doing science. What is more fundamental to me is having that kind of mindset, the growth mindset, and the approach to it of saying, actually, maybe we don't know what the answer is here, so let's test some things and find out. And whether you test that to the level of a randomized control trial, which is the ideal, or you're simply doing it in a way which is giving you some useful insights that you can then build on, doesn't really matter, I think, because in business, all you're seeking is a competitive advantage. You're seeking to do better than the next guy, and behavioural insights is a great way of doing that, or is a great vehicle to allow you to do that. And so you don't need to be producing to the level whereby you can get an article in Nature, because if you get an article published in Nature about what you're doing as a business, you've lost your competitive advantage. So to me, that's as an anecdote, was something that's always stuck with me, because I'll be honest, it stuck with me partly because it was the moment where I realised I probably had to get out of public sector for a bit, but also because there were a few too many people around with that kind of mindset, but also. The other reason was that it demonstrated, I guess, that kind of fixed mindset quite well.
And I think it's really interesting when you talk about that because, I find it really strange that people don't think to experiment where it's a human dynamic. So we're perfectly prepared to try things like, does this IT system work? Does this implementation of a manufacturing process, is it improvable? But we don't deploy that same attitude when we think about humans. We just do what we've always done. And it seems very strange to me that we haven't made that particular leap. And I wonder if that isn't something to do with what you've just outlined, which is the way that behavioural science is often sold. It's highly complicated. You need to have lots of trials. You can run these whole infrastructures and you need to document. And there's a complexity of language that goes with it. Well, actually, there's some really basic stuff that anyone can do to improve things to some extent. You won't get the optimal answer, but maybe you don't need the optimal answer. Maybe you just need for it to be less crap than it was before. And therefore, we don't need to go through all those technicalities. And I'm struck by the fact there seems to be an impediment to people adopting this, which is clearly that this niche that you and I are jumping into to say, look, here's a different way of looking at the world. Why don't you try this? And I'm intrigued to know that your thoughts as to why people aren't taking that approach when it's perfectly logical to do it for manufacturing systems. We just tend not to do it when it involves people.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things going on, which is that one is that, I guess when you think about the biases and heuristics that exist within business decision making, I think there is specifically, one of the things I do talk about in the book is that, I think we have this misconception that when people talk about, most of the work that I've done around applying behavioural science has been looking at external targets, if you want, for want of a better word. When I was working in the Department of Health, we were talking about smokers, and we were, we were addressing smokers who not people who worked within the department. In the same way, having come from marketing and advertising world, most of the time it was about, consumers or potential consumers of our product. And when we look at, when we think about decision making within businesses, particularly, there's this misconception that as soon as we walk through the door of our office or workplace, whatever it might be, we put on our work clothes, we suddenly become the kind of System 2 stereotypical Spock-like decision maker, and these heuristics and biases, completely vanish. And actually everything that I've seen, and certainly the evidence base that I've seen in terms of the research that I've done and looked into, is exactly the opposite. That if anything, we become more prone to various non-rational drivers of behaviour in a business context. And there's a certain logic to that, because if you think about the risks of making a wrong choice in business, is that if I make a bad decision at work, which could lead to me losing my job. Me losing my job could lead to me losing my house. It could lead to losing, all kinds of horrible outcomes. Whereas if I make a bad decision in the supermarket and buy the wrong brand of shampoo, the consequences of that are pretty insignificant, both financially and personally. So all of that means that there is a strong tendency within business decision making to defensive decision making. So, making a decision that we can justify to our superiors in that context. And a whole host of biases are associated with that around, effectively, social norms and following the herd in terms of going with the same kind of, or following the behaviors of other people and not wanting to kind of zig when other people zag. Whereas actually, if you think about how businesses gain competitive advantage, it's exactly doing that. It's doing something that differentiates or that is different from your competitors. And I think the other aspect of it as well is that that it leads to being very loss averse and being quite obviously, as you know well, coming from the risk industry, that it can lead to people being quite risk averse in the decisions that they make. And so, exactly as you say, the one of the reasons for testing, in my view, and one of the reasons for having this experimental approach to issues around or human behaviour within business is precisely because you're removing the risk from it. One of the things that always mystified me working in the media and advertising industry, for example, was that clients would come to us and say, we've got a £5 million budget that we want to spend on this particular campaign. Tell us the best way to spend this money. And we would always go back with the solution that spent all £5 million and say, right, these are the channels that you're spending it on. Whereas if you were adopting a more scientific, a more rigorous approach to it, what you should say is, let's spend £50,000 on testing a few different things, and then the remaining 4.995 million on, once we've got those insights, on what we know is most effective. But that never happened, because all of the incentives that exist within that industry are run contrary to that. And so, you know, I think it's a combination of those things in terms of the way that the biases operate within business decision making, and also the way the incentives are lined up, lead to people being naturally quite averse to actually experimenting in that way. You know, and I think, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is that when you look at the most successful 21st century businesses, you know, I talk about the FANGs in the book, so Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. What differentiates them for me, and I think this was a light bulb moment for me in writing the book, was is that you can look at a certain amount of their success and how they've built these successful, you know, monolithic products and dominant products in their categories because of the way that they've integrated behavioral insights and nudges, if you like, into the way that they've designed those products and services. But also the fact that they have established, or the way that they built those and the way that they've, for want of a better word, weaponized those in terms of their business has been through continuous testing and learning. You know, what differentiates those successful businesses is the number of experiments that they are running on a continuous basis. Jeff Bezos, you know, every time he makes a public statement, he says something to the effect of that Amazon's success is a function of how many tests we're running every day, every week, every month. That's purely how they've got to their market dominant position. You know, Amazon Prime is an example I use in the book, whereby the econometric modeling that they conducted around Amazon Prime said that it was going to be a massive failure, and it was going to cost them millions and millions of dollars. But they decided to test it anyway, just in case that was wrong. And what they found was that in the first year, yes, it did lose them money, but actually what they know now is that the average Amazon Prime customer visits the site nearly twice as often as a standard Amazon customer. And they're not spending more each visit, they're just visiting more regularly. And Amazon has become much more their default because of that power of free, of around, you know, the free delivery that the Amazon Prime product offers. So, and the only way they could get to that was by testing it in the real world with live customers. So, you know, I think that's, you know, I've covered a few different things there, I think, but all of those factors are things that I think mitigate in a lot of businesses against them adopting the more kind of experimental approach and tending to go with, you know, with the received wisdom, with, you know, what the highest paid person in the room thinks, rather than being willing to experiment.
I think the Amazon example is really interesting. I read a piece the other day that was talking about Bezos' divorce as being a potential risk factor for Amazon, because up until now, although it's a public company, Bezos controls it and he can take long-term punts on things and try stuff out. So you get Amazon Web Services or the Prime piece that you just talked about. And Bezos can afford to do stuff because he can afford to think longer term, and no one's gonna stop him from doing it. And so he's removed some of those obstacles and impediments that allowed the business to do all kinds of things that, you know, if you'd started out and invested in an online bookstore, then you probably would go a bit nuts if the person who was doing that suddenly went, well, I'll get into web services or other products. But because Bezos controls the company, he can do that. And this article was basically saying that because he's having to hand over large swathes of his shareholding to his wife, all of a sudden, you know, potentially his power and his ability to think past some of those short-term bias and prejudices might actually stop him from doing some of the things that he wants to do. So there's a diminution, if you like, of the benefits that Amazon currently has. So their theory was that potentially his divorce could see Amazon losing some of its strategic advantage, which comes from him not having to think traditionally.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because I guess that's one of the key challenges here is that, you know, I guess what to a certain extent I'm describing in terms of that approach to continuous testing and learning. I talk in the book about the MVP approach, which is you know, that's the kind of the gospel in the startup world of minimum viable products, where, you know, you build a version of a product that's pretty basic but is good enough to get out in the marketplace. And then you use the data and insights around how people are using that to optimize it. And for me, that was a real, again, a bit of a light bulb moment in terms of going, well, actually, if you're using behavioral insights and behavioral science effectively, then you should be testing and learning in that way. And there's a natural synergy really between those two approaches. And some of the work I did in Australia, particularly with developing the My Quit Buddy app, is an illustration of that I use in the book. And I think in order to do that, or the reason why startups find it easier to do, is because that is the kind of the culture and philosophy of those organizations is based around that. It's based around the continuous testing and learning. With that Amazon example, I can see the point in that, if this is the way that Bezos has set up the company, and it's been come from the top down, you can say, well, if he's not there anymore, or he doesn't have as much influence anymore, then will that philosophy survive? But I would argue, that if you look at a company like Google, for example, where the founders have minimal nowadays have minimal involvement in the running of the business, as far as I understand, then it's because they have built that into the culture and the way of working in the business, and it still, to some degree, maintains that kind of that approach to innovation of continuous experimentation. Then it shouldn't matter who's there. It shouldn't matter who's in the chair at the head of the table. It should be something that's just baked into everyone's way of working. I think the one thing I would say at this point, which is something that I cover within the book, is there are a lot of risks involved with this approach. So you only have to look at Facebook and what's happened with Facebook over the last few years, because one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg again eulogized about the way that Facebook worked was that any engineer within Facebook has the ability to take what they call the trunk version of Facebook and then suggest changes to it, and then serve a different version of the Facebook interface to a subset of their total users to conduct a test to see whether it actually delivers a better experience. The problem with that is that if you give everyone within the business the authority to do that, and when you're dealing with a product like Facebook, which holds a lot of personal information about people and private information about people, then the risks are huge. And the Cambridge Analytica scandal is possibly the tip of the iceberg in terms of that. So one thing I do cover within the book is around the ethical dimensions of, yes, empowering people within the organization to conduct tests is great, but if you are handling personal data in any way, shape or form, you need to have the right processes and checks in place to ensure that you're not, well, firstly, you're not breaking the law, but secondly as well, that you're not crossing out any number of ethical boundaries.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting there as you were talking, which sort of, had a flashback to your comments around supermarkets. And if you empowered supermarket staff in the same way that you do Facebook staff, you'd have people rearranging the store, randomly trying stuff out and causing absolute mayhem. Or even worse, car manufacturers, right? I thought I'd just take this button out or remove this feature to see what happens. And we can't allow that to happen in the physical world. And what I think is really interesting is that the digital experimentation is permitted in the culture. It's part of who they are. But also because the products are digital, and you can have punts on things and just see what happens. And there's a story that you tell in the book, which I think is fascinating, around the Google homepage and why it is. And I'd love you to retell that now because it's fascinating.
Yeah. So, this was, again, a really interesting finding for me, and something that I read about initially, and then I verified by talking to a couple of people I interviewed for the book. I should say, in terms of the book, it's not just what I think. I interviewed 25 experts from a variety of different fields to get their insights, and that's what in my podcast that those interviews are excerpts from those interviews I did for the book, and I spoke to a couple of ex-Googlers as part of it, and they confirmed this was the case. So the Google homepage, when it launched in 1998, I don't know how many people listening will remember that. I certainly do. When it launched, it was quite different to all of the other search pages out there. And I think that's in itself is interesting in that Google wasn't the first search engine. It is obviously the absolute dominant player in the global search market now. But it is, but it wasn't when it launched. It wasn't the first. It hasn't achieved that position purely by first mover advantage or through creating the sector, if you like. There were lots of search engines around, like Alta Vista and Ask Jeeves and Yahoo and so on, which have steadily fallen by the wayside. And what differentiated the Google homepage, and it remains largely functionally the same now, so 20 odd years later, was that you had one search bar and then the two buttons underneath, which are Google Search and I'm Feeling Lucky. And as I say, that's still how it looks today. And there's the interesting thing about why it was so simple and clean compared to the other search engines. So if you went to Alta Vista in 1998, you wouldn't be able to search just with one click, you wouldn't be able to search. There wasn't one search button. There were multiple search buttons depending on what category you wanted to search in. For example, if you used Ask Jeeves, you had to write you had to write an actual question. So you couldn't just say capital of Albania if that was what you wanted to find out. You had to say, what is the capital of Albania, ? To use Ask Jeeves, which is an incredibly cumbersome way of encouraging search. And so one of the reasons that Google achieved its market dominance was purely because of the cognitive ease of using it, of being much easier than the other search engines. And what's interesting about why that's the case is that Larry Page, when he created Google, he didn't have HTML coding skills. So he couldn't create the kind of complicated, cluttered interfaces that Alta Vista and Yahoo had because he just didn't have the skills to do it. Now, what's really interesting about that is that once he created it with just that simple one search bar and then the two buttons, was that as Google grew and it became a more viable business, what they were then able to do was to test that and to identify it's because we don't have this one search bar that it's much more effective for people. But what's really interesting, I think, as well about that is that they still have, as I say, the two search buttons of Google Search and I'm Feeling Lucky. And I'd urge your listeners to do this if they're interested in it. Ask how many of people that use the I'm Feeling Lucky button, because the data is a little bit old now, but the last time I could find it was researched in about 2007, and it was said that 1% of all Google users were using that button. These days, I suspect it's as close to zero as it makes no difference. And yet the button still stays there. And the interesting thing about I'm Feeling Lucky is that if you don't know how it works, is that if you press I'm Feeling Lucky, you don't see the search results. You just go straight through to the top search result for whatever your query is. Now, the thing about that is that actually loses Google money, because Google makes money by showing you paid search listings when you go to the search listings. If you go straight through to the first page, you don't see those, so they don't get any money from those advertisers. But yet the button's still on the page. And it's really, when I found this out, I was very curious as to why that is. And the conclusion that I came to is that, the reason that button is still there, and Google has tested this, and it will because it tests everything, as I was saying earlier, is because of the self-efficacy or confidence it gives users in the results that you get. By having a button there that says, I'm feeling lucky, what it's implying to you as a user is that Google search results are so good and so accurate that you don't need to see the listings. You can just go straight through to the first one. However, knowing humans as we do, and knowing the fact that humans like to have a limited amount of choices in order to be able to choose what we perceive to be the best choice, we still like to see the search listings. And we still like to have a little browse, even if ultimately we might only look at the top two or three and then probably end up clicking the top one anyway. So it's a really interesting insight, I think, into the way that people look at and use information and how that influences our behavior, but also around how Google have built that cognitively easier interface. They've effectively created what you might call a placebo choice of having the I'm Feeling Lucky button on that page. And they've been able to verify that. I should say, in terms of the listings, it wasn't pure luck that Google achieved its dominance. Larry Page's PhD thesis was on information retrieval. So he understood about how people wanted to see information and how to build the algorithms to search, to get the most relevant information for the search query. But the actual interface itself, the reason why that was so simple was pure luck, in that he just didn't have the skills to do anything more complicated.
And I think it's really indicative, and I mean this as a compliment, of some of the rabbit holes that you go down in terms of some of the things you've discovered. And there's a natural curiosity there as to why is something being done this way? And of course, often when we ask ourselves those questions, things seem illogical. And, as you were talking about Google, I mean, they're wasting a heck of a lot of virtual real estate when they could slam ads on you at page one, but they choose not to do that. That costs them money, but in the short term at least, but arguably not in the long term. And I think there's a really interesting thing here, and this is sort of classic Rory Sutherland stuff, which is let's try some illogical things. And we seem to be leaving a heck of a lot of value on the table from a commercial perspective, from a creative perspective, from making the world more fun and more sustainable, because we constrain people in the wrong ways. And when you get organizations that free up their human capital, you get some really interesting outcomes, particularly where you allow that human capital a little bit of free rein to go and try some stuff out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Rory has this great phrase that I quote in the book, which is test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't. And that for me is a really, is a fantastically pithy kind of way of putting it. In the value of behavioural science and behavioural insights is that, as you say, it sometimes leads to these kind of irrational, illogical solutions. But they are by definition a competitive advantage because if they were logical, then someone would have come up with it before. It's and that's the value of really understanding that you say those human factors and empowering people to think like that within your organisation is a to my mind is the most important way of driving innovation within a business. I mean, I would say that because obviously it's the work that I do, but it's, it's to me, the beauty of it is one of the things that I get a real kick out of from doing this job is when you stand in a room and present these kind of counterintuitive solutions to people and you see the puzzled look on their faces and then being able to say, trust me, it works, especially if we have been able to experiment and have the data on it. I mean, one of the examples I use in the book, if I can just give another example, is that some work we did with a bank here in the UK, a savings bank. And one of the challenges that we addressed a number of different challenges that they had with their customer experience via the call centre. So customers calling up to the call centre with queries or to make a transaction. And one of the things that we noticed was that the security processes were A, taking too long, and B, an awful lot of people were failing the security process when actually it was quite clear it genuinely was the customer. It wasn't someone trying to get access to the account. What we noticed was that the way that the security process was framed was so the way that the call center agents were talking to customers was putting them under quite a lot of stress. And what that means is when you put someone under stress is that it impacts on what we call mental availability. So basically just our ability to recall information. And obviously what you're doing with the security process is you're asking people to verify they are who they say they are by remembering these security questions that they've provided answers to possibly several years ago. And so, because bear in mind it's a savings bank, so people are transacting not very frequently with a particular bank. So what we did was we reframed the scripts around the security process to help them through that security process. So to give you a simple example, the way that the question would be framed would be to say, if you pass security, then I can help you with that, with your request. Now, that instantly kind of puts you a bit on the back foot because it raises the possibility of you failing the security process. And it makes people nervous and it makes people anxious. So what we did was we simply changed the framing of that to say, when you pass security, which is using a bit of positive psychology, if you like, a bit of self-efficacy in terms of saying, giving people the confidence that they will actually get through that process. And what we noticed was that instantly it put people more at ease, it made them less anxious, and it actually made them able to recall the information more effectively. But I think the really nice kind of counterintuitive solution to that as well is that, as I say, one of the main thing we were trying to address was that a lot of these customer calls were taking far too long. Partly because people were failing security so often, which meant they had to go through multiple processes. And the thing about that is that, obviously calls taking too long is bad for the customer because none of us like spending more time on the phone to the bank than we need to. we've all got better things to do with our time, to be honest. But the other aspect of it is that obviously that's from an efficiency viewpoint. It's not great for the bank either, because they're not able to handle as many calls as they would if the calls were a bit shorter. So but one solution that we proposed to that, having recognised that people were failing security processes unnecessarily, was to say that you need to say to customers, take your time. Now, you can imagine that's quite a difficult solution to present to a client when the client is saying, our calls are taking far too long. And then we say, well, we want your call centre agents to say to customers, take your time. Because it's the complete opposite of what you think you want to achieve. But actually, we found that was really, really important and really effective, because what was happening was that customers, particularly bearing in mind, you might be calling up because you're wanting to transfer a deposit because you're buying a house. Quite often they were under high stress circumstances anyway. Then trying to rush them through the security process was resulting in them getting their answers wrong or blurting them out, or just, as I say, as a result of being in this, what you might call an emotional hot state, being under undue stress was causing them to get the answers wrong. Whereas just saying, take a breath, take your time, was much more likely to result in them getting those answers right the first time, and therefore reducing the overall length of the call. And that proved to be the case. So I think it's a really, that's a nice example of where one of these, behavioural science and this understanding of how, as I say, being in a state of stress impacts our ability to recall information, was incredibly useful, but also led to a better outcome, but one that was derived from a really kind of counterintuitive solution.
Yeah, there's a lovely example of a compliance requirement that I came across the other day when I was renewing some insurance. And the person on the other end of the phone says, he's been very helpful up until this point and really engaging with me in a very human way. And then he suddenly sort of says, I now have to read you the following. And it's strange because he knows I'm not really listening. He's not really paying attention. And this thing that is designed to protect me and make me aware of what I'm buying actually ruins the whole experience for me, because there's this presumption that I'm going to be listening, that this will somehow protect me. And, the design of that, and it's partly a regulatory thing, is that it's no thought to what is it like for the person going through the experience. And that's what behavioural science is all about. And so I think, you could do a heck of a lot with this stuff if one actually spent a bit more time saying, what's it like for the people going through the process? And how does it feel? Because it feels totally at odds to the rest of the conversation, which has felt very customer focused. And so I look at these things and just say, I think that traditional ways of doing things don't necessarily get the best possible outcomes. And you could redesign that process by making me aware of what I'm signing up to by different ways, rather than just reading a boilerplate piece, which both sides of the conversation know is something they're not really focusing on what they're reading, and I'm not paying any particular attention. So in that perspective, it's completely failed. And I think if you think about these things from an organizational perspective, you can save money. From a customer perspective, you can make it more engaging. And I think if you don't think about these things, you're going to miss those opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, exactly as you say, this is a lot of the work that I do is in the financial services sector for precisely this reason. The emphasis or the primary consideration is around compliance. And often I've found multiple instances where we've been working with these kind of challenges around customer experience, where the scripts in these particular cases have been written by a legal team or a compliance team, and obviously their objective is to convey the necessary information in a way that meets those regulatory requirements, rather than actually what is delivering the best possible experience for the customer and delivering the outcome that we want, which in this particular case is to get them through that process as quickly as possible. And what's interesting for me was that when I first started talking to clients about this, and to banks about it in particular, they would go, oh no, we're going to have real problems with compliance, I'm not sure we'll get legal on board with this. But actually what you find is that that it's never been a problem for me, because we're not changing the information that's conveyed. The information is still there, all the legal requirements are still there. All you're doing is changing if you like, some of the words around the periphery, or you're changing the way that information is framed in a way that leads to a better experience for the customer, and ultimately leads to more compliance than you would have had previously. So it's exactly as you say, it's a win-win in that circumstance, and I've not had a situation yet where I've had a legal or compliance team who've said to me, "Oh no, we can't do that." Unless it is, there are some limited circumstances where there is a set wording dedicated, or there is a set wording dictated by law. But usually, again, there's still, as with that security example that I just gave you, a lot of the changes we made were about how we introduced the information. It wasn't about the actual information itself. I completely agree with you.
Yeah, this is why when I sort of push my compliance piece a bit, because yes, there's prescriptive wording, as in that insurance example, but there are just so many examples in organisations where process is followed, and particularly employment law driven, for example, that says that we need to make something happen so that if we need to fire someone, we put ourselves in the strongest possible position. And so, if you're having to fire, let's assume it's 2%, 1%, I don't know, less than that of your company, it does strengthen your hand to have forced people to go through a certain process. And it makes it easier to get rid of them if, for example, they fail to do their training, or they've signed up but they've attested to something and they haven't done it. It does strengthen your hand there. But we don't look at what that does for the remaining 99% of staff, which is that you've really pissed them off. And so I think when we try and implement these things for the risky minor number of times it happens, where life would be a little bit harder if we didn't have that, we're missing a trick here, because it has an implication for everybody else. And so when I look at this, I just think there's huge, rich pickings that we can get into. He said pushing his own agenda slightly, but I think, there's so much we can do, and there's rich pickings across organizations if we start to focus on this topic.
Oh, of course. Absolutely. And I think, there are, it's likely in a lot of circumstances that there will be, when we talk about customer interactions in that kind of context, for example, that, in like the banking context that I just mentioned, in that case, I think it was only probably about 20 to 25% of the total conversation was scripted. A lot of it was more, there were ways in which the customer service representatives had freedom to talk about, products and benefits and to guide people through whatever the transaction was that they were going through. And it was there where the real value, I think, was delivered as well, in terms of, we didn't just give people scripts and say, oh, now say this, because it would be proven to work, is where you provide that training and you provide the tools for those people who are interacting with customers and clients, for them to understand the value of both of using these kind of nudges and behavioural science techniques. But also, there is a key element for me, which is that, if you are having those kind of conversations, it does need to sound natural. And so it's far better to give people the tools to do that, and encourage them to kind of create their own solutions, than it is for, as I say, just to give them a script and say, read this, because no one likes talking to a robot. To a certain extent, or particularly when that isn't actually a robot, it is actually a person.
Yeah, that just makes it a whole lot worse, because you've demonstrated that you have the capacity to be human, and somehow that's been stripped away from you. Absolutely. So that's a really important piece for me, because I think one of the things that particular project I just mentioned, they actually as a customer service and a customer experience. They actually scored pretty highly in terms of the quality of service they delivered. What was holding them back and what was not delivering a good experience to their customers were some of these processes and some of the back office systems that they had in place. And so the project that I was working on, they were changing a lot of those back office processes, but also what they were doing was, I was brought in specifically to look at, okay, the nature of the interaction with the customers, the nature of the conversation with the customers, how can we optimize that, and make that a better, both, make those calls shorter, as I mentioned, but also make that a better experience for customers. And that was interesting to see those two things working in parallel, really, in terms of we were able to, to improve some of those processes and improve the structures, including within the team structures as well. But also that we were able to influence and change the nature of those interactions with customers as well, and make those as effective as they can be. And I think those two things do go hand in hand. Fabulous. Well, look, we could keep this conversation going on for forever. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. The Behaviour Business is out globally, available on Amazon. And of course, the Behaviour Business podcast that accompanies the book is also unsurprisingly available globally and on all the usual platforms and comes highly recommended. Richard, thank you so much for spending the time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Good to speak with you.
That's it for another episode of the podcast. My huge thanks to Richard for appearing and to you for listening. If you're not already a subscriber to the Human Risk podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. If you had a few minutes on that platform to leave a review for the show, that helps maintain the profile, allows me to continue to attract high quality guests, and lets other people find it. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.